Good evening and welcome. My name is Joyce Kennedy, and I'm the Director of Community Relations here at Concordia College, and I am honored and excited to present tonight's speaker. We have a great program ahead, and you're going to hear some fantastic information. We just had dinner with her and a couple other people. It was just an amazing discussion, so you're in for a real treat tonight, and I hope you enjoy it. Tonight's event actually came about from a case of insomnia. When I found myself unable to sleep one night back in May of 2017, I did what most of us do, and I got up and opened up my Facebook. There in the wee hours of the night was an ad for a recently released book called The Radium Girls, the cover of which glowed in this eerie sort of luminescent green. I clicked read more and soon found myself mesmerized by the story of these young women who 100 years earlier unknowingly poisoned themselves through their work in a radium dial factory. As the radium began to unleash its horror inside these women's bodies, they turned to each other and, through their bond of friendship, fought for their lives and for justice for generations of workers who followed them. The very next morning, I sent an email to author Kate Moore in London and invited her to speak at Concordia College and share the story of the Radium Girls. Kate first discovered these courageous young women in 2015 when directing the play These Shining Lives, the story of the dial painters of Ottawa, Illinois. While conducting research for the play, she realized there was no book that focused on these women and what they went through. Feeling passionately that the women deserved to be recognized, Kate decided to become their ghostwriter and bring the Radium Girls to life. Kate's research took her all over the United States, to Newark and Orange, New Jersey, to New York and Washington, D.C., and to Chicago and Ottawa, Illinois. She walked in these dial painters' footsteps, she met their families, she visited their homes and their graves, and visited the sites of the dial painting studios. Kate remembered all of them: Molly, Grace, Catherine with a K and with a C, Quinta, Marguerite, Charlotte, Marie, Ella, Peg, Inez, Olive, and Pearl. Once back in London, Kate began to weave together the story of who these women were, who they loved, who loved them, what were their dreams, their hopes, and their fears. From her exhaustive research to her 250,000-word working timeline, Kate achieved her goal and more through the Radium Girls. Since its release, the book has won numerous literary awards and has been on the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller lists. Please join me in welcoming author Kate Moore.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Thank you, Concordia College, for hosting me this evening. And thank you to all of you for coming out as well. It's incredible to see so many people here this evening coming out to hear about the Radium Girls. It's my passion project to make sure that people know about them. And if I can ask anything of you this evening, it's that you tell just one person what you heard tonight, that you heard about these amazing women, what happened to them, what they achieved. Because, as I say, my mission is to try and make sure that they are remembered and they're not forgotten. And you can now help me to play a part in that mission. What I'm going to do this evening is kick off with a short reading from the book, just an edited extract, so you can get a sense, if you haven't read the book, of how I've chosen to tell this piece of American history. Because even though it is history, I didn't want this to be a dry and historic book. I wanted to bring the girls back to life, and I therefore chose to write this history book as narrative non-fiction, which means that it reads like a novel. And I hope that these real women will come alive for you, and that they'll feel like friends for you, and you can walk in step with them on their journey. Once I finish the reading, I'll then talk more generally about the Radium Girls, who they were and what happened to them, and then about my research for the book, and there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end. So if you have any, please don't be shy. Please do put up your hands and ask anything. I'm very happy to take questions. So let's get going. I'm going to read an edited extract from chapter 1, which always seems a pretty good place to start. Our setting is Newark in New Jersey, and the year is 1917. Catherine Sharp had a jaunty spring in her step as she walked the brief 4 blocks to work. It was February 1st, 1917, but the cold didn't bother her one bit. She had always loved the winter snows of her hometown. The frosty weather wasn't the reason for her high spirits on that particular icy morning, though. Today, she was starting a brand new job at the watch dial factory of the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation, based on 3rd Street in Newark, New Jersey. It was one of her close pals who had told her about the vacancy. Catherine was a lively, sociable girl with many friends, as she herself later recalled. A friend of mine told me about the watch studio, where watch dial numerals and hands were painted with a luminous substance that made them visible in the dark. The work, she explained, was interesting and a far higher type than the usual factory job. It sounded so glamorous, even in that brief description. After all, it wasn't even a factory, but a studio. For Catherine, a girl who had a very imaginative temperament, it sounded like a place where anything could happen. She was an attractive girl of just 14. Her 15th birthday was in 5 weeks' time. Standing just under 5'4", she was a very pretty little blonde, with twinkling blue eyes, fashionably bobbed hair, and delicate features. All her life, Popular Science later wrote, Catherine Sharp had cherished the desire to pursue a literary career. She was certainly go-getting. She later wrote that after her friend had given her word of the opportunities at the watch studio. I went to the man in charge and asked for a job. And that was how she found herself, outside the factory on 3rd Street, knocking on the door and gaining admittance to the place where so many young women wanted to work. She felt almost a little starstruck as she was ushered through the studio and saw the dial painters turning diligently to their tasks. The girls sat in rows, dressed in their ordinary clothes and painting dials at top speed, their hands almost a blur to Catherine's uninitiated eyes. Each had a flat, wooden tray of dials beside her. But it wasn't the dials that caught Catherine's eye. It was the material they were using. It was the radium. Radium. Well, it was a wonder element. Everyone knew that. Catherine had read all about it in magazines and newspapers, which were forever extolling its virtues and advertising new radium products for sale. But they were all far too expensive for a girl of Catherine's humble origins. She had never seen it up close before. It was the most valuable substance on earth, selling for $120,000 for a single gram. That's $2.2 million in today's values. To her delight, it was even more beautiful than she had imagined. Even as she watched, little puffs of it seemed to hover in the air before settling on the shoulders or hair of a dial painter at work. To her astonishment, it made the girls themselves gleam. They were using slim camel hair brushes with narrow wooden handles. Yet as fine as the brushes were, the bristles had a tendency to spread, hampering the girls' work. They had to make the brushes even finer. And there was only one way they knew of to do that. We put the brushes in our mouths, Catherine said, quite simply. But of course, it wasn't simple at all. And that's why I'm standing here before you this evening, talking to you about the Radium Girls. Because that seemingly innocent and innocuous act of putting a paintbrush laden with radioactive paint between their lips led the Radium Girls down a path they could never have anticipated following. It led them down a path where these ordinary women achieved extraordinary things. They became poster girls for workers' rights. They left us a scientific legacy that stretched through the decades and into the future. And they changed the world. They made it a better place. So who were the Radium Girls? Well, Catherine Sharp is actually a very typical example. So the women were young. Most of them were teenagers, 14, 15, 16 years of age. But actually records show that some of them were as young as 11. And they came from poor working class families, many of them the daughters and granddaughters of immigrants. So Catherine herself had German heritage. And dial painting was known as the elite job for the poor working girls. And that was for several reasons. Number one was the money. Dial painting for the most skilled workers was an incredibly lucrative profession. The girls weren't salaried, they were paid by the number of dials that they managed to paint each day. And those women who were at the top of their game were in the top 5% of female wage earners nationally. The dial painters earned more than 3 times the average factory floor worker. So at this time, before women even had the vote, some of these girls were earning more than their fathers or their husbands if they had them. But it wasn't just about the money. And one of the most charming things I discovered in my research was when I looked up the women in their town directories. These listed their names, addresses, and occupations. And when I went to Ottawa, Illinois, where I was researching another group of dial painters who used the exact same lip pointing technique, and I looked up the name of Catherine Donahue, one of the key Radium Girls in Illinois, I found her name listed there in the town directory. But next to her name, it didn't say dial painter. It said artist. And that artistic and skilled nature of the work was also a huge motivator for the girls and something they took great pride in. And let's not forget the historical context. So Catherine Sharp is going to work on her first day on the job in February 1917. Now, the history buffs among you will know that just a few months later, in April, America joins the First World War. And immediately, there's a huge boom in the radium dial painting industry because Catherine and her friends are not just painting watches and clocks to make them glow in the dark. They're painting aeronautical dials. They're painting the instruments and the dashboards of warplanes and warships and automobiles. And all of these are needed to fight the war in Europe. And so the women also were motivated by patriotism. Grace Fryer, who's another of the key Radium Girls, signed up to the studio just 2 days after war was declared. She had 2 brothers who wanted to fight in France and had gone and crossed an ocean to do battle. And she joined up to do her bit for the country. And because of this boom in wartime dial painting, the companies needed more and more women to fulfill that demand. And one of the most heartbreaking elements of this tragedy for me is that those girls who were lucky enough to have a job as a dial painter, the moment they heard the company needed more workers, they promoted this elite job to their sisters and their cousins and their friends. So Grace Fryer got a job for her little sister Adelaide, and Catherine Sharp secured occupation for her cousin Irene Rudolph. And so when what happened next happened, it didn't just happen to a single daughter in a family, but to 2 or 3 or 4. But for the women working in the war, they found that those friendship networks made the studio a fabulous place to work. There was a wonderful sense of social camaraderie between the girls. And when I was researching in the archives, I found photographs of the women at company socials. They had picnics. They ate ice cream on their breaks. And I found snapshots of Grace Friar, where there was a little brook that ran behind the studio, and people had made a makeshift bridge across the brook with a couple of planks. And I saw snapshots of Grace sitting on that makeshift bridge, swinging her legs with her arms around her friends and colleagues as they were just enjoying being at work. And part of the appeal of the job too was the glamour of dial painting. As Catherine described in that opening chapter, the women would get covered in the glow from the dust, the radium dust that they were using. Because Radium Girls mixed their own paint, they used a kind of powdered radium, and they mixed it with an adhesive and some water to make a liquid paint. But as they handled that powdered radium, in the same way that if you're in a restroom and you're using some talcum powder, the dust goes everywhere. And that's what happened to the Radium Girls. It wasn't just on their shoulders and their hair, it was literally inside their clothes, beneath their corsets and their lingerie. And they found that even after vigorous rubbing, they could not get that glow out of their skin. But it was a very glamorous glow. And in the same way that today, if you go to a gig in a stadium, you'll see people with glow sticks. The Radium Girls had a similar fun and fabulous glow to them. And Catherine Donahue actually wrote that the women in Illinois used to wear their good dresses to the plant, because when the girls went out dancing after work in the speakeasies and the music halls, the Radium Girls would be the ones shining and shimmering with that glowing dust marking them out as something special. The women used to use the paint as a kind of cosmetic as well. They would paint their nails with it or eyeshadow, sometimes just use it as a joke and paint on a comedy moustache or a chin. They would paint the buckles on their dress or the buttons. And when they walked home at night through the darkened streets of Orange and Newark in New Jersey, or in Ottawa in Illinois, or in New York, where dial painting also occurred, the Radium Girls would shine like ethereal spirits as they walked home, and they were nicknamed the Ghost Girls. And they had no fear of the radium. In fact, working with radium was perhaps the most compelling reason of all to join the studio. Because as hard as it is for us to appreciate today in our modern age, radium at this time in the 1910s and 1920s was not only seen as safe, but actually beneficial to health. So if you went into your local drugstore, you could buy radioactive dressings or pills to treat anything from hay fever to impotence. And if you struggled with that particular affliction, you could also purchase a radioactive jockstrap to try and boost your sex life. There were a whole plethora of industries that sprung up around radium, which had a reputation as a wonder element. So you could buy, if you had the money, radium cosmetics, face creams, soaps, and powders to give you a glowing complexion. You could buy radium chocolate, where the radium combined with the sugar and the cocoa to give you an additional boost. And radium was not just seen as something you took when you were ill, but it had a reputation as a kind of elixir of youth, something that would stave off middle age. And that's not a new thing. We might find it hard to believe that radium was seen as a wonder element today, but I think we can appreciate how that society, which I think is the same as our society today, is always looking for the next big thing, the next magical thing that's going to keep us young and keep those years at bay. You only have to open a magazine or flick on the television to find someone celebrating the next big thing. And I think in our day, it's perhaps a wheatgrass shot or a kale salad. Radium was essentially the kale of the 1910s and the 1920s, but with horrific side effects. And so people, rich people, would actually consume radium as a kind of vitamin. People drank radium water, and the recommended dose was 5 to 7 glasses a day. But even though radium had this reputation, the Radium Girls weren't entirely naive when they were told by their companies they had to put the brushes in their mouths. Because even if the radium was safe, they're still being told they have to put a paintbrush laden with paint in their mouths. And so May Cubberley, who trained Catherine Sharp, she said when she was told to put the brush in her mouth, she said the first thing we asked was, "Does this stuff hurt you?" But the companies said no. They said it was safe. They said the women did not need to be afraid. But that wasn't quite true. And my book actually opens not with the chapter 1 that I read you earlier, but with a prologue dated 1901, 16 years before Catherine Sharp is going to work on that February day. And it opens with a scientist who's carrying a vial of radium in his waistcoat pocket, receiving a radiation burn from the radium. It had eaten away at his tissue and destroyed it. And so from the turn of the century, people knew radium was dangerous and destructive to humans. And you can see the evidence of that in one of the most shocking things that I found in my research, which is that on the same sites of the dial painting studios, in the laboratories next door to where the girls are lip pointing, the lab workers, the male lab workers working in those labs, are issued with protective equipment to protect them from the radium. They're given lead aprons and ivory-tipped tongs. They're told they have to take enforced vacations so that they don't have prolonged exposure to the radium. And so in this same company, where the lab workers are protected, the girls are told it's safe to swallow it. The difference, other than gender, is that the Radium Girls were using a tiny amount of radium, whereas the lab workers were handling large amounts. And the received wisdom of the age is that even though a huge amount of radium could kill you, a small amount was safe. But why did they think that? They thought it because the companies who were making money out of radium and were the ones who were perpetuating all those industries that I've described, which were incredibly lucrative industries. It was those companies who were funding the research to find that a small amount of radium was safe. And so they found what they were looking for. And they discounted all other evidence to the contrary. People actually died of radium poisoning before the first dial painter even picked up her brush. But you didn't read about that in the magazines and newspapers. That wasn't mentioned in the adverts for all these products that the companies were selling. And so people didn't know, but the companies knew. The companies knew the truth. Even though radium was destructive, science tried to harness that power. And this too is partially where this reputation as a cure-all came from. Because when at the turn of the century they realized radium was dangerous, they wondered how they could harness that power. And it was a power. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years. That means it is at its highest level of radioactivity for all those centuries. Nothing diminishes it, nothing destroys it. It simply gives off that radioactive power for all those centuries. And so scientists thought, well, how can we use this power? And they actually thought, because radium itself seemed to be indestructible and seemed to live forever, that perhaps we could harness that and make humans immortal. I found salesmen who literally used that in their sales presentations. And I found articles in the Newark Evening News from the 1920s where they were urging their readers to eat radium tablets because they said doing so would, and I quote, add years to our lives. This came about because scientists were using that destructive force for good. Radium was used to treat cancer very quickly after its discovery in 1898. And of course, it had remarkable results because the same force that gave that scientist a radiation burn could destroy a cancerous tumor and save lives. And so effective is radium to treat cancer that we still use it today for that same purpose, although we use a different isotope. So it's not a radium that will be that powerful for all those centuries. Instead, it has a half-life of hours or days. But because radium saved lives, people thought, well, what else can it do? And can we take that life-saving element and use it for health? And again, this is why all this research was conducted and all these industries sprang up. But of course, we know today that radium is not safe. And despite what the companies hoped for, it is not safe even in small amounts. So as the years passed, the Radium Girls began to get sick. Radium poisoning is a very insidious poisoning. It takes years to show itself. So by the time the girls do start to get sick, it's several years later. The war is over. Many of them have left the studio. Grace Fryer has gone to work in a bank. Many others have left to marry and have children. And so the women are not dial painters when they start to get sick, which happened maybe 5 years later, but in some women it took decades before the poisoning started to show itself. But it always did in the end, and to explain why, I'm just going to talk briefly about the science of what was happening inside the women. So radium is biomedically very similar to calcium. That means that when the human body tries to decide how to process it, it treats it in the same way as calcium. And we probably all know that we're supposed to drink lots of milk to make our bones strong. I think we all got that marketing memo. You drink milk for the calcium that makes your bones strong. Well, when the Radium Girls consumed the radium, the human body looked at it, their bodies looked at it, and it thought, I know what to do with this. It's biomedically similar to calcium. I'm going to deposit it in their skeletons. And that's what happened. It ended up in the women's bones, in their teeth, in their jawbones, in their spines, in their limbs. And once there, it emanated its powerful radioactivity. When they studied the women later, they found that those bones were honeycombed and moth-eaten in appearance. They had holes in them. Holes that had been drilled there by the radium while the girls were still alive. I don't know if you can even try to imagine the agony of that. Catherine Sharp tried to describe it once, and she said the only thing she could compare it to was a dentist drilling on a live nerve, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day. The doctors didn't know what was happening to these women. They were young women in their 20s now, But the doctors were so perplexed by their symptoms because these were Radium Girls. They'd worked with the wonder element. Surely they should be in the peak of health. And instead they were becoming crippled. Their legs were starting to shorten or spontaneously fracture. Their teeth were starting to fall out. And so the doctors, perplexed, simply diagnosed the girls with rheumatism or arthritis, and they sent them home with aspirin. Aspirin. When their bones are being riddled with holes, when Grace's spine is being crushed by the radium, each vertebrae destroyed, so that she has to wear a steel brace to keep her upright and erect. These women were in agonizing pain, and yet no one was helping them. No one was paying attention to what was happening. No one understood. But those friendship networks that had once got the girls their jobs now came into their own, because the women talked to each other. They might not have been dial painters anymore, but they were still sisters and they were still friends. And so Grace and Catherine talked to one another, and Grace would say, "My back is hurting." And Catherine would say, "My jawbone aches." And between them, the women started to piece together what was happening. And even though the Radium Girls felt the poisoning in different places, in different types of intensity, they realized that it must be the same thing affecting all of them. And as Catherine Sharp said, as the women grouped together and they talked, they realized that there was something going on about this thing. But even though it was obvious that the only common denominator amongst all these women was the fact they'd worked with radium in the studio, still the authorities did not pay attention. Dozens of women had died before they started taking note. And the thing that made them pay attention in June 1925 was when the first male employee of the radium firm died. Only at that point did an autopsy commence. Only at that point did they truly start investigating what was happening inside the girls. Could it be radium? Well, yes, it was. But even once they got that diagnosis, the companies refused to admit responsibility. Not only that, they continued to perpetuate the myth of radium safety. Because, of course, if they acknowledged that what had happened, it meant the end of all those lucrative industries, and they cared more about the bottom line than they did about their expendable workforce. And what this book describes is the girls' journey and their fight. Because these companies did everything in their power to silence these women. They tried to discredit them, to shun them, to silence them, to dig up dirt on them. They embarked on the most callous cover-up you can imagine. To read this book, to read the company memos where it's there in black and white exactly what they did to these girls, is to be shocked and horrified and to become so angry about the fact that these young women, Grace and Catherine and Pearl, all of the Radium Girls, they just didn't care what they were doing to them. But the women, despite the pain and the agony they were in, despite the fact that they were fighting against an incredibly powerful corporation that used every contact they had to try to shut the women up, these women kept on fighting. And for me, one of the most extraordinary things about their story is that strength in the face of adversity and the altruism of their fight. Because these women were so sick. They were facing certain death. And yet they chose to use their last vestiges of energy and literally at times their last breaths to speak up and fight for what they believed in and to fight for what was right. And that altruism for me is extraordinary because there was no hope for the Radium Girls themselves. And there was no money as they embarked on their landmark legal fights to try and hold an employer responsible for the health of their employees. And just to illustrate that, I want to tell you about a Connecticut dial painter who did win a settlement. It came after she had died, so it was her widowed husband of just 6 months who received the payout. But what they gave this widow, this young man who had lost his wife, Mildred Cardo, what he received for his wife's death was $43.75. So no money and no hope. And I think one of my favorite quotes in the book comes from Grace Fryer. And she was asked about why she was filing suit. And she said, "It is not for myself that I care. I am thinking more of the hundreds of other girls to whom this may serve as an example." And I think the Radium Girls are an example to all of us of what we can achieve when we band together with like-minded individuals and we stand up for what we believe in. They're an example that no matter how powerless you might feel, no matter how strongly someone tries to silence you, with patience and persistence, you can make a difference. They are so inspiring to me. Their courage, their dignity, their strength, and their legacy. Because they didn't just change legislation and workplace safety. They didn't just completely make workplaces safer, not just for other dial painters, but for everyone working in radiation industries, in any industry. The Radium Girls case eventually led to the establishment of OSHA, which now works nationally in the United States to protect workers. But they also gifted us a scientific legacy, because the type of radiation poisoning suffered by the Radium Girls was a type of radiation poisoning never before seen in human beings. And as the 20th century continued into the Second World War with its Manhattan Project, into the 1950s with its nuclear arms race, and into an age of nuclear power, we needed to know about radiation and the human body. And so the Radium Girls were studied for decades. They were exhumed. Those who had not yet passed away voluntarily submitted to scientific testing. And the world's knowledge of internal radiation comes from them. They left us all an extraordinary gift through their sacrifice, and we all benefit from it every day of our lives. But despite this extraordinary legacy, many people have never heard the story of the Radium Girls. And you're probably wondering, how did I discover it? Well, Joyce hinted at it earlier. I didn't know the story of the Radium Girls. How I came to it was completely serendipitous. I wasn't looking for them. In a way, they found me. I just made my directorial debut for the stage, and I wanted to do another play because I'd loved the experience so much. And so I Googled great plays for women, because I wanted a play that would put women at the heart of the story and give actresses an opportunity to play incredible characters. And the play that came back was These Shining Lives, about the Illinois dial painters. And the moment I found it, I connected with it. I ordered the script, and I didn't even finish reading it. I read only the opening monologue, and I turned to my husband and I said, "This is the play I have to direct next." I felt compelled to do it. I felt a connection with these girls. And so I pitched it to my theatre company. My pitch line was Erin Brockovich meets Made in Dagenham, starring the Pink Ladies. And they loved it, so we applied to America for the rights. We had to pitch to Melanie's agent to say, can we put it on in London? And the answer came back, no. No, you can't do it. I would not take no for an answer. Already these girls were precious to me. And I don't know what it was, but I had to tell this story on stage. So I phoned Melanie's agent in America, and essentially I begged to be allowed to put it on. And the moment I got the yes, which I did get, I started researching. because I knew this play was based on a true story, and I knew we were portraying real people, and I felt this huge responsibility to do justice to their story and to them. So I started researching, and as Joyce mentioned, I found 2 books about the girls, one on their legal legacy and the other on the science of radium. But that was it. There was no book about the women themselves, the individual women. If they were known at all, they were only known by this anonymous moniker of the Radium Girls. And you didn't know they were called Catherine Sharp and Grace Fryer and Catherine Donahue and Pearl Payne. And I thought that was wrong. I thought they deserved a book that celebrated them and honoured them and that respected their personal tragedies and what they and their families had endured. And so I felt so passionately about it that ultimately I thought, well, if no one else has done it, why don't I? And it wasn't an easy decision to make because, as you've appreciated from this presentation, this is a story full of science and full of law, and it's a history book. And I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a scientist, and I'm not even a historian. I studied English at college. But ultimately I thought, well, what I am is a woman. And perhaps what the Radium Girls need is not another scientist or lawyer speaking for them. Perhaps what they need is an ordinary woman, just like they were ordinary women, who can look at their story and their experiences and see the humanity in them and the intimate, personal details, and not to see them as scientists did, and I found this in the archives. The scientists referred to the women when they died as fresh bones for their studies. And I would never see them like that. And so I decided I was going to do it. And I pitched the book, and I came to America to research it. And that was essential for me because I wanted to literally follow in the women's footsteps, to walk the streets that they had walked, to visit their homes, their graves, the sites of the dial painting studios, to inhabit their world that they had lived in. And primarily I was looking for their voices. Joyce said earlier about how I feel I'm the ghostwriter of the Ghost Girls. And that's true. I didn't want to speak for them. I wanted to facilitate their voices to speak out if I could find them. And so I was hunting through all these archives looking for the girls' own accounts of what had happened to them. I hoped that maybe they had left some clues behind. And they had. I found diaries and letters and court testimonies. Their voices had been there in the archives all along, just waiting for someone to listen. And I want to share with you one of the most powerful moments for me in my research, which is when I went to a tiny museum in Illinois. And I'd heard on the grapevine they had some Radium Girls material. So I bounded through the door full of enthusiasm. And I said, I'm writing a book about the Radium Girls, and I hear you've got some material. Please, can I see your archive? And the woman looked really confused. And she said, well, I don't know how much it's going to help you, but, sure, I'll show you what we have. And she walked me over to this display cabinet, and it wasn't even the full display cabinet, it was just a corner of it. And she had a copy of the book about their legal legacy and a single photograph of the girls at work. And that was it. And I said, are you sure you don't have anything else? She was like, no, I've worked here for years, this is all we have. And I thought about it for a moment, and then I said, would you mind asking your manager, please? I was very British and very polite. And so we did. We went and asked the manager, and he kind of scratched his head, and he was like, I think there might be something in the back. Feel free to have a look. And so I went into their back office, and I lifted this dusty folder off the shelf and started going through it. And in that dusty folder, in this small back room of this tiny museum, I found letters between Catherine Donahue and Pearl Payne. And I can't tell you the power of that moment, because I had met these women through a play. I had directed actresses to portray them. I'd improvised scenes from their lives. And yet now I was holding in my bare hands the paper they had held, the real women. I could trace with my finger the indentation that Catherine Donahue herself had made with her pencil 80 years before. And I could read her words about how she felt to be a Radium Girl, how lonely she felt in hospital, how worried she was for her husband in the time of the Great Depression, where he's out of work and yet having to find the money somehow to pay Catherine's medical bills. I found letters from Pearl too, an account of her life. She described how she came from a large family and how she wanted a large family of her own too. She had a daughter in 1928, but then Pearl got sick. And in Pearl, the radium poisoning affected her gynecologically. And ultimately, the doctors said when she was in her early 30s that she had to be completely sterilized and have a hysterectomy. And Pearl fought it. She tried everything she could. She got second and third and fourth opinions. She tried different types of treatment. She tried everything. But ultimately, the only way to save her life was to consent to the operation. And it was heartbreaking to read her words about what the radium had done to her, to read about how she didn't feel she was a proper wife to her husband anymore, to read about the children she had longed for but could never have. The book is dedicated to the dial painters and those who loved them. And it was essential for me to explore not just the girls, but also their families, the husbands who had lost wives, the children who would grow up without a mother, the parents who buried not just one daughter, but 2 or 3 or 4. And so the final part of my research was to connect with the family members. I reached out to sons and daughters, nieces and nephews and sisters, and every single family I reached out to was universally generous in their response. They wanted this story to be told after all the cover-ups and all the silencing that had gone before. They opened up their hearts and their homes, their scrapbooks to me. And I want to just finish by telling you about 2 interviews that moved me. They were with Catherine Donahue's niece and nephew. And her nephew described her sick room for me, how Catherine liked the room to be dark with the shades drawn. But Jim said that even though the room was dark, there was a light inside it from Catherine herself. Because that radium that she had once used to make clocks and watches glow in the dark was in her skeleton. And Jim said you could see every bone in her body glowing from the radium inside her. When I spoke to her niece, she summoned the sights and the smells and the sounds of Catherine's sick room. And I asked her, did Catherine ever cry out with the pain? Mary closed her eyes as she answered me. And I could tell that she wasn't with me in her sitting room anymore. She had gone back 80 years in the past, and she was back in her aunt's house. She took a while to answer, and then she shook her head. And she said no. She didn't have the energy to scream. All she could do was moan. She was just moaning. I think what I'm most proud of in this book is that even though Catherine Donahue lost her voice at the end, in this book she speaks again, and you can hear her. You can hear all of the Radium Girls. My name might be on the cover, but it's their book and their story. And I just want to finish by telling one last anecdote about when I came to America to promote the book when it was published in 2017. And a TV company wanted to do an interview with me on the site of the Dial Painting Studio in New Jersey. So once again, I went out there and walked the streets that the women had walked. And while I was stood right on the site of the Dial Painting Studio, the phone rang, and it was my US publisher. And they were phoning to tell me that the book was a New York Times bestseller. And it was so perfect that it was there where I got the news, because I felt them with me. I was there where they had lived and died. And this is not my success. This is their success. And I'm so grateful to America for embracing them, for hearing their story, to all of you for coming out tonight to learn about them. Because in their lifetimes, they were silenced and discredited and shunned. But finally, America is paying attention to them. You're celebrating them. You're honoring them. So I just want to finish by saying thank you for listening to them. Thank you. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
I'm wondering over and over again about their children, and were there adverse effects suffered by the children?
I'm just going to repeat the question in case people can't hear it. Were there adverse effects suffered by the children? People often ask this, and I have to preface my answer by saying they've never done a big scientific study to find out, what are the statistics, did it not? Anecdotally, from the women I studied, it's almost like a 50-50 split, that some of them were affected. Obviously, some of the women did have fertility issues, they couldn't conceive, or they were miscarriages or stillbirths. Those children who did survive were sometimes premature, they had stunted growth, they had osteoporosis, they died young, sort of before the age of 30. But other children were absolutely fine, no problems at all. And in fact, I was with a Radium Girls daughter for dinner on Saturday night, and it was the first time I'd met her. And she'd reached out to me after the book came out, and I said, if you don't mind me asking, have you had any ill effects? And she's 91, and she's had no ill effects whatsoever. And I think the difference, again, just anecdotally, is that if the Radium Girls hadn't yet had their poisoning set in when they were having their children, because it took several years, to show any signs of the symptoms, those children seem to be absolutely fine, no problem. Whereas if the women were very sick, if they were already suffering from the radium poisoning when they were conceiving and gestating their children, those are the children that seem to have had ill effects. Thank you. Lady there.
Yeah, there's an interesting anecdote to this whole thing where science uses as a base, or it did, and look at the early Atomic Energy Commission in the 40s. They used something called the standard male model. And it's about a 5'7" male, about 150 pounds. And it doesn't consider physiological differences of a male-female version of a body. And even as late as in the early 1990s, even when science was looking at medications to treat cardiac troubles, it was based purely on the male version. So in these Atomic Energy Commission ratings, you'll see they measure the weight of the gallbladder, but there were side notes like, well, women wouldn't really be around this. They maybe would be working as secretaries and things. So even from 1917 going forward, and even today, you have to look at how science assesses what all the interconnected parts are. And so, but thank you for your great work. I haven't read the book. I will dash and get one for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for raising that interesting point. I don't know if people heard it, but the lady was saying that sort of safety standards and medicines and everything are based on an average male figure, and they don't assess, well, will women react physiologically different to this radiation exposure, to this medicine, and so on.
So your, distinction of what the males were wearing iron aprons and maybe different doses, but they're also not even looking physiologically the differences of who was doing what.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Was this problem only in America? Were there any other countries dealing with this?
It wasn't only in America. Radium was an international craze, so it was literally all over the world, and in the archives there's German chocolate companies. In the UK, everyone had dial painting studios because everyone used radium paint. When I first wrote the book, all the stuff I read in the archives was that lip pointing only happened in America, because they inherited it. That it was girls from a China painting factory with a water-based paint who lip pointed, and then they took the technique into radium dial painting. That's apparently where it started. And I had heard that there wasn't lip pointing elsewhere, and so it wasn't the same aggressive poisoning, although Radium Girls did die because, of course, there's lax safety standards, they're handling radioactive materials with no safety equipment. But since the book has come out, I have had some people in the UK say to me, actually lip pointing did happen here too. So, but it's quite interesting. I think the legal cases were only in America. Yes.
How long did your research take you? How long were you here in America?
How long did my research take? I always preface the answer by saying that, one, I'd spent a lot of time with the story because of doing the play first, and two, I was working 7 days a week and sort of 18-hour days because I had a really tight deadline. The research took about 4 months. I spent a month in America, as Joyce was saying, gathering the material before going home and analysing it all and putting it in my timeline. And then I wrote the book in a month. I didn't sleep. I didn't sleep. Yeah.
I understand that my grandfather worked in that. Wow. And I was very curious to find out if you had any idea or if you came across any research with the names of the men that were working there. I understand that he would come and show the girls how to use the paintbrushes.
Yeah.
But he died in 23, and I did not understand that he died from radium. Things were very shush in those days, and you didn't hear too much details.
Yeah.
But did you run into any information about the men?
Yes, so this lady was saying she believes her grandfather worked for the company, and did I find any material about men? Yes, I did, and the men were also, those who had been exposed to radium were also studied and tried to track down and that sort of thing in the scientific studies. Obviously, I was focused on the girls, so yes, I did find key names like Dr. Lehman, who's the chief chemist, von Sohotsky, who is, the man who sort of founded the studio. There were a couple of other names as well that I came across, but my research wasn't focused on that. And obviously, the company was a huge company, so I was also focusing the research just on the dial painters.
If there's any way I could find out, because he did work in the Newark factory as far as I know, and I'd love to confirm it that he actually was.
Yeah, if you want to email me, my website is on the book, so track me down. Thank you. Yes.
Did you contact the historical societies in the states that have the factories? Is that how to begin, to gather the information? And also, did you have any grants to support your research, your expenses, etc.?
So the first question was, did I contact any historical societies? The museum that I mentioned is run by a historical society, but that was actually the only one. I think if I was doing it again, I probably would reach out to more, but as I was describing, I was on a really tight schedule, and to be honest, I didn't know much about historical societies in the US. I know a lot more now. So my research was primarily focused on the local newspapers, the sort of special collections that I found. So in New Jersey, Harrison Martland, the Rutgers University, there's a big collection on the Radium Girls. Because of the scientific studies, there's a huge collection in the National Archives. So I was more focused on special collections. And the second question was, did I have any grants? No.
Sorry? You did your own fund, too.
Yeah. Yeah. And part of my advance as well for, writing the book. Any other questions? Yeah.
You said the powder went all over. Was it brown where that factory was?
Yeah. So she was saying, because the powder went everywhere, was the site affected? Yes, absolutely. And one of the shocking things about the story is that the radioactive waste from the plant, which was almost like a kind of sand-like substance, it was not only used in landfill all around New Jersey, but also used in children's sandboxes. And there was a huge cleanup operation in about the sort of 70s, 1970s, 1980s, because homes had been built on that landfill.
How did they clear it? It was indestructible.
Well, they dig down into the earth and they basically sort of take out, literally they go, several feet down, like hundreds of feet down, and they literally move the soil, the radioactive soil. I don't know where they take it. Where do they take nuclear waste from the nuclear power plants? That'll be where they take it. So it's supposed to be clean now. It was like $1 million operation to try and clean it up because it was everywhere in New Jersey. Not just the dial painting studios, but all those places they'd put the radioactive landfill. Any other questions? Hi.
So the attorney from New Jersey who helped little girls with their lawsuits, as part of the settlement, he could no longer bring a lawsuit, and he adhered to that?
Yeah, so part of the settlement that the New Jersey lawyer had to sign was that in order to get some money for his clients, he had to sign a disclaimer essentially saying, I will not only not take on any more Radium Girls cases in the future, I will not help any other lawyer with any Radium Girls case in the future. They essentially gagged him. So that, because he was he was doing well, he was getting settlements and things. So they didn't like that. They wanted to silence him as well. And as I say, the only way they pay his clients money is if he adhered to that. And yes, apparently he did. I found letters in his archive saying, I'm really sorry, but he had people writing to him all over, and he had to write back and say, I'm sorry, I can't help you. But he did stay in touch with his Radium Girls, throughout their lives. So it was actually quite heartening to read about him. He'd give them lifts because they couldn't walk because they were crippled. One of the dial painters, Quinta, her husband was domestically violent, and it was Raymond Berry who stepped up for her, got her out of that situation, went round to her house to get clothes so that she didn't have to go and get clothes from her violent husband, and represented her in court. So he did keep helping, but only those ones that he could. Yeah. Is there any other questions? Hi.
Have you gone back to the play at all and edited now that you know so much more about it?
Have I gone back to the play at all? Well, I did the play twice, but both, we basically felt so passionate about it that after the first run, the cast and I got together and we were like, we don't want this to be over, we want to keep telling this story. So we self-funded transfer to a different theatre to run it for a longer run. But that was before I started my research. I haven't gone back to it since, and what I was kind of shocked and sad about is that as I did my research for my non-fiction book, I discovered that the playwright had fictionalized quite a lot of it, the women's characters in the play. So there's a dial painter called Charlotte Purcell, who in the play is a fabulous character. She's, wisecracking, gin-swigging, she was a flapper, she smokes, she drinks, she flirts. And the real Charlotte was an incredibly devout, quiet woman, a mother of three. She stayed in and, she stood up for what was right, but she was very sort of humble about it and nothing at all like this character. And Melanie had also had Catherine and Tom Donahue married throughout their journey, which is obviously a necessary dramatic choice because you need to know that couple through the play to feel their pain when the tragedy hits. But that isn't what happened in real life. They only got married after Catherine had left the studio. So I don't know how, I think for me, I had to look at it that I loved the play. It's beautifully written. It's a beautiful portrayal of the story, but it isn't quite the true story. But I can appreciate its artistry and its heart for what it is, and I respect the creative choices that Melanie found. Yeah.
Hi, will there be a movie?
Will there be a movie? I think the Radium Girls deserve one. There's been a bit of interest from Hollywood, so my response is always, I'm keeping my fingers crossed, but I'm not holding my breath, because I think it takes a long time to get stuff happen. But I really think they deserve an authentic film about, the real women and their real battle, so fingers crossed. One more? Anyone got any one more question? Yes.
Are you working on anything new now?
Am I working on anything new now? I was asked that over dinner. Yes, I am. I'm working on another American history book, but it's very, very, very early stages. So I can't reveal what it is, but yes, I'm working on something new, and I hope you guys will all pay attention to what it is when it's revealed in due course.
So we can have her back again.
Thank you.